But good afternoon, friends, guests of Stratford Hall. I'm Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi. I'm the Vice President of Research and Collections and the Executive Director of the Jesse Ball DuPont Memorial Library. And before we turn to this afternoon's presentation, a few brief announcements of upcoming talks. On March 19th at 7 p.m., Dr. Jacqueline Beatty of York College of Pennsylvania will help us to commemorate Women's History Month with an online talk entitled Reclaiming Women's Power in the American Revolutionary Era. Advance registration is required. Tickets are available now, and I've included the link in the chat. So feel free to register for that. Again, that's March 19th at 7 p.m. On April 9th, Professor of Southern History David Silkenat of University of Florida will help us to mark the 160th anniversary of the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. And on April 19th, Dr. Gordon Steffi, that's me, will mark the 250th anniversary of the shot heard around the world with the gripping tale of how a Lee of Stratford played a pivotal role in the Massachusetts event that opened the revolution. So stay tuned to stratfordhall.org for details and registration links for those April talks. So let me begin by saying that every day of every month is an opportunity to study and to learn about a Black history, not just the 28 days of February, but thanks to the efforts of Dr. Carter G. Woodson and later Black educators and students at Kent State University, it became somewhat more difficult in February to ignore and much more common to commemorate and learn about Black lives, Black histories, and Black cultures. And this is all the good. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was a learned society founded by Dr. Woodson, establishes a theme each year for Black History Month. The theme for 2025 is African Americans and labor. This is a rich theme that invites attention to and reflection on the transformational work, free and unfree, skilled and unskilled, vocational and voluntary, of Black folk here and elsewhere, historically and today. Stratford Hall was home to generations of enslaved Africans and African Americans. In 1738, the British ship Liverpool Merchant arrived in the Potomac after a voyage of 167 days, carrying 70 enslaved Africans consigned to Thomas Lee, who was just then redeveloping this site in Westmoreland County as his new home, which he would call Stratford. Tree ring dating of the dendrochronology of the timbers that were used to frame the Stratford Great House dates then to the same year that the Liverpool Merchant delivered those 70 enslaved Africans to Thomas Lee. Stratford and the Lee family depended on the labor of the enslaved, whose lives were emphatically richer and more finely textured than their work alone. We're honored to have an engaged descendant community that helps us to recover and share some of those stories. Now, as part of our commemorations of Black History Month here, and with sure relevance to the theme of labor, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Ana Lucia Araujo. Dr. Araujo is Professor of History at the historically Black Howard University in Washington, D.C. She specializes in the history and memory of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and is interested in the visual and material culture of slavery. Her recent books are Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, A Transnational and Comparative History, The Gift, How Objects of Prestige Shaped the Atlantic Slave Trade and Colonialism, and most recently, Humans in Shackles, An Atlantic History of Slavery, which you may see over my right shoulder, and a bit blurry. You can see more copies behind her. And that is the text on which this evening's lecture is based. In the United States, Dr. Araujo's work has been supported by fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Getty Research Institute, and the American Philosophical Society. She's a member of the International Scientific Committee of UNESCO Roots of Enslaved Peoples Project. Dr. Araujo, welcome, and I turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Stefan. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Soon I will start then sharing my screen, and I stop sharing sometimes, then just bear with me. The book that I am presenting today arrives then in a moment in which slavery and its legacies are more than ever intensively discussed in the public sphere. And let me just show here what is the book. So here in Virginia, presidential plantations such as Monticello, Mount Vernon, and Montpelier only started memorializing their histories associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade over the past 17 years. And Stratford Hall followed the same path then a few years ago as well. Once these wounds associated with slavery were exposed, we can't move backwards despite the current context. Yet I would say that following the assassination of George Floyd, the fall of the Confederate and pro-slavery monuments in the summer of 2020, the moment where we are now, and especially I would say in the southern states, is marked then by a backlash against the recent attempts to make history of slavery visible in the public space. And in my previous works, I have explored the reasons that this new interest in the history of slavery has surfaced then in recent years. And in these previous works, I have argued that this relevance, then the moment, this important moment that slavery became a relevant topic, has little to do with what really happened in the past, but is much more concerned related to how racism and present day social and racial inequalities perpetuate the exclusion of people labeled as Black in societies where chattel slavery existed. Because racism and white supremacy persist in the Americas and in the United States as legacies of the Atlantic slavery, this long and painful past still matters. And still here the goal of my book, even if it's a book that speaks to this present day debates, the major goal of the book is to tell the history of slavery in the Americas, but doing so, what I am trying to do here is to redress some of the distortions and imbalances that we can find in existing histories of slavery, these general histories of slavery. Most of these histories have centered on the British North Atlantic Road, and especially the United States, and in particular, the English-speaking Caribbean colonies. So these histories have also generally excluded the central role of Brazil in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, while also ignoring then the history of Africa and the role of enslaved women in the institution of slavery. And in addressing then this kind of imbalance of these general histories of slavery, and approaching then the long history of these human atrocities from a panoramic point of view, this book is in dialogue then with the work of historians who over the past decades have criticized then the emphasis on a purely demographic and economic approach. And among these historians, I can say that we have then Marcus Rediger, then Michael Gomez, Ira Berlin, the late Ira Berlin, and many others such as Jennifer Morgan, for example. And these historians, they have called other historians, to write human histories of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, human histories that emphasize the lived experience of enslaved men and women and not demographics and economics. So what I say is that the persistent emphasis on the British colonies of North America and later the United States, as well as the British West Indies, including the emphasis on the year 1619, tends to obscure indeed the real dimensions of slavery and the slave trade in the Americas. You know that approximately 12.5 million Africans were brought to the Americas, and during the entire period of the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 389,000 enslaved persons who had been forced then into slave ships in African ports came ashore in North America. Meanwhile, we had about 3.4 million enslaved Africans who disembarked in the British and the French West Indies. So this is a number that is almost 10 times higher than the number of enslaved Africans that landed in the United States. So the year 1619, we know that is a site of memory for African Americans and has been for many decades. Earlier, before the year 2019, when the 400th anniversary of that date was commemorated. And what I want to emphasize is that we can only understand 1619 through the lens of the Luso-Brazilian, the Portuguese and Brazilian slave trade, because you know that those Africans were brought to Virginia through the Caribbean. Back then, they were indeed seized from a Portuguese slave ship, then ended up in the Caribbean and then being transported to Virginia. So for Black citizens and people in general, elsewhere in the Americas, the year 1619 is not significant, is not a year that people know about. Also, we can say that, and this is a fact, that in the 100 years that preceded 1619, there were at least 307,000 enslaved Africans that had already landed in the Americas. So this is more than the estimated number of enslaved Africans that were brought from Africa to the United States during the entire period of the Atlantic slave trade. So when 1619 occurred, then the slave trade had been in full swing in the Americas for more than 100 years. So there is nothing about origin in 1619 except as a site of memory. Also, more than 4.8 million enslaved men, women, and children landed in Brazilian shores. This is the largest number of than in the Americas, and more than 10 times the number of enslaved Africans that were brought by force from the African continent to the United States. So Brazil here is not only then the country that imported the largest number of enslaved Africans in the Americas, but is also the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. So today, as part of this inheritance of this long history of then slavery and slave trade in Brazil, Brazil has the largest population of African descent outside Nigeria in Africa, which is the country with the largest population in the African continent. So with this book, I wanted to challenge how the history of African bondage in the Americas has been told and written, especially then in these books written for larger audiences. Indeed, even in Brazil, the books that we have, these general books telling the history of slavery, have been written by journalists. And in the English-speaking world, these books do not exist. Then books that really take into account the role of Brazil in this long history. So let's just talk a little bit about slavery and what does it mean, because this, of course, could be then the debate for several other books, but I think that is important for us to situate this debate, especially in this moment when there are so many public contentious debate about this long past. So slavery existed in many societies around the world, even before antiquity. In all these societies, slavery had both similar and contrasting elements. Still, we can say that because slavery was a mode of production and also an institution regulated by customary and statutory law, it's very hard to make generalizations regarding what slavery is and what slavery is not. But despite then this, let me just stop sharing by now. But despite changing then over time and space, human bondage persisted throughout history, bearing then a certain set of features that make then was possible identifying it as being slavery. And I insist here on the set of features because if taken individually, each of these elements is not necessarily sufficient to define a labor regime or a mode of production as slavery, which is also why sociologists and anthropologists examining then various societies have disagreed over time about what is slavery. So as we discuss the various definitions of slavery, we have to recognize that only with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery started specifically targeting Black persons, then people who are labeled as Black from the regions that encompassed then West Africa, West Central Africa, and Southern Eastern Africa. So the first chapters of the book, they develop this discussion about the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and why Africans were those targets. And here, Brazil and Portugal, they matter, and not Britain, because it's really Portugal that started then the trade in enslaved Africans, first to the Iberian Peninsula and then to Brazil and the Americas in general. So transplanted to the Americas by European colonizers starting then in the late 15th century, the institution of slavery was then an economic system of dependence. Slavery then sanctioned the possession of human beings as movable property and could only exist through violence and coercion, even though customs and laws regulated the existence of slavery. So, regarded as commodities, enslaved persons could be bought, sold, displaced, overworked, tortured, beaten, violated, and murdered. But more than providing then forced labor to an owner, bondspeople were then subjected to relations of power. So in societies around the world where slavery existed prior to the late 15th century, and here I include Greece, then and Rome, Black Africans, they were never the majority of the enslaved population. And of course, the institution of slavery existed then in ancient Egypt, though not in big numbers. Black Africans also represented only a fraction of those living in bondage in ancient Egypt. So historians pay attention to the number of enslaved people in each society in order to determine the nature of these societies in terms of the relative importance of slavery as an institution within them, and then to determine if a society is a society with slaves, then or if then a society where slavery existed, or if that society is a slave society, then a society where slavery played really a central role, as it was the case of the south of the United States and also the case of Brazil. So also important to have in mind that Africans and their descendants were not the first populations to be enslaved in the Americas. slavery existed in Native American societies prior to the arrival of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, and the enslavement of Native Americans persisted after European conquest. Moreover, even though the book does not examine then the trade and the enslavement of indigenous populations in the Americas, I emphasize that as Europeans invaded and occupied the territories of these First Nations, they enslaved these men, women, and children, and also they created other systems that were slavery-like to exploit their workforce. Although often illegal and concealed then from public view, the trade in indigenous peoples continued to exist, for example, in Brazil in the 18th century and in the United States throughout the 19th century during the occupation of the West. So my book is this hemispheric and Atlantic history of slavery that puts side by side Brazil, the West Indies, the Spanish-speaking Americas, and North America. And I place Brazil and the South Atlantic system, then that area that encompasses Brazil and Africa, at the center of the narrative, then highlighting then the realities of African societies during the era of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. And here my main claim is that Brazil, the Luso-Brazilian slave trade, and their African contexts are central to fully understand the long and painful realities and the long and painful history of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas, as many of the contexts that we could find in African societies, especially in the coastal areas, were mirrored in the Americas, especially in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, in the Caribbean as well. So another point that the book makes is that slavery in Latin America, then in the Spanish colonies of the Americas, and also in Brazil, that was a Portuguese colony, it was not, slavery in Latin America was not a benign or then a benevolent institution, as many people did, even scholars and students, they still believe. And here in the book, I challenge this widespread and misleading idea that views slavery in Latin America and Brazil as then softer than if compared with the harsh conditions of bondage then in the British colonies of North America and also in the Caribbean. Then I contend that indeed in Latin America, slavery, and Latin America, including Brazil, slavery was as violent, if not worse, than what we could find in the United States and in the Caribbean. So based on these points, Humans in Shackles, this book explores in particular the social, the cultural, and the religious dimensions of the lives of enslaved peoples. Now, of course, that a historian can follow different threads to write this painful history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Most general history books, as we said earlier, most of these books about slavery in the Americas, they have focused on the United States. Since the mid-20th century, books examining the economy of slavery have also privileged a national perspective, even though slavery and the Atlantic slave trade relied on transnational economic systems of human exploitation, exchange, and competition. And we have indeed a few exceptions, then with few exceptions indeed, known of these national histories of slavery in the United States truly attempt to examine the lives and work of enslaved people by considering the African continent as an important component of Black life in the Americas. So Africa is a sort of background, but we are looking at the slavery in the Americas by disconsidering, by forgetting, and thinking that Africa is not important in this equation. So in many respects, even today, cultural approaches are considered as the work of sociologists and anthropologists as well. And this is something that this book, it tries to take into account, this cultural approach. Also, several monographs and books intended for larger audiences have focused on the slavery as part of the context of the Civil War in the United States. Most of these books have been written by men, and most of these general books about the slavery in the Americas have also tended to ignore the work, the lives, and the experiences of enslaved women. So leaving African American women historians to examine these histories of enslaved women in separate books. So in this book, Humans in Shackles, what I try to do is to break with these existing general books by providing them this general overview of Atlantic slavery in the Americas, take into account Africa, take into account Brazil and the South Atlantic system, and also taking into account the histories of enslaved women. So while I engage with the history of slavery in the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America, I argue that Brazil was a crucial player in the continental and transoceanic history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And I also insist that Brazil is inseparable from the African continent until at least the middle of the 19th century, which is also why Brazil, Africa, and Africans occupy then a prominent position in this book. Now, a number of general books about the history of slavery have also privileged economy, then the economic dimension of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. In Human in Shackles, I don't exclude, of course, this economic dimension because we're talking here about slavery, but and I also do not exclude statistics and demographics. However, the book is a cultural history craft to show the human perspective of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Then this human dimension of their histories, that is what I am interested in showing. So the book follows then a chronological order and also a thematic approach. Then I explore in the book the trajectories of men, women, and children from Africa to the Americas by examining then how European powers reached Africa and traded within African societies, and how Africans were captured, how they were transported to the coast, and how they crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the holds of slave ships. The book also explores how African captives were sold in slave markets and other settings in the Americas. And then I look at their living and working conditions on plantations like the ones that we have here in Virginia, and Stratford Hall included. But not only in plantations, I also look at the lives of enslaved people, men and women, in urban areas. So paying then a particular attention indeed to the work of enslaved women who often fed the cities, not only in Brazil and the Caribbean, but also here in the United States, by selling food, for example, in the streets and also in urban markets. And sometimes it's really a continuation of the work that these women perform in the African continent. So by doing so, I show how, despite the violence they had to endure, Bondspeople, for example, they created families in conditions that were the most difficult ones. Now, the book itself is comprehensive in terms of its scope, and I rely, of course, and expand on the existing scholarship on the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas, with the goal here of contributing to a better understanding of the global legacies of the Atlantic slave trade and human bondage. And by doing so, I underscore that the Atlantic slave trade in the South Atlantic and the history of slavery in Brazil are central to understand the full dimensions and multiple complexities of the inhuman institution in the Western Hemisphere. And I also argue that the internal contexts of West Africa, and especially West Central Africa, in the region that is present-day Angola, they not only shaped the rise of the Atlantic slave trade to the Americas, but also continue to affect the patterns of the trade in enslaved Africans until its abolition, then in the second half of the 19th century. And here I remind you again, because many of us, when we think about the Atlantic slave trade and the African continent, and people who go sometimes to visit slave trading sites in Africa, they go to Senegal, they go to the Gold Coast. But the majority enslaved Africans that came to the Americas, they came from the region of West Central Africa in what is present-day Angola. So I remind the readers again here that Brazil, since its early colonization, developed then privileged links with West Central Africa, especially then with the region that I just mentioned, that is present-day Angola. These particularities indeed favored by the predominance of a sort of bilateral trade between these areas, and we didn't have between Brazil and West Central Africa what we call the triangular trade, but you had the bilateral trade direct from Angola to Brazil and also from the Bight of Benin to Brazil. This is the system that became known as the South Atlantic system. So in this space, we had then the continuous exchanges between Africa and the Americas that were so important that they indeed persisted after the end of the Atlantic slave trade. So because of the fact that there were large annual imports of African-born individuals, in the case of Brazil, Brazil became a crucial spot where African cultures and religions survived, evolved, adapted, and mixed. And more than anything else, it's a place where these cultures developed a dialogue then with European and Native American cultures. Although this process carried features that were similar then to other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, these cross-cultural exchanges often contrasted with what we could find in the British colonies of North America and what later became the United States, where the imports of African-born individuals were less than 10 times smaller than in the case of Brazil. So Brazil imported then 10 times more enslaved Africans directly from the continent than it was the case in the British colonies of North America. So to juxtapose then the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic system, I also underlined that a significant proportion of African-born enslaved people were introduced in the region of present-day North America through the inter-American slave trade, especially through the Caribbean. And here I highlighted the dramatic growth of US enslaved population between 1790 and the years preceding then the Civil War. This new phase, indeed, provoked by the rise of the cotton industry and the invention of cotton gin, marked then the new expansion of slavery in the United States, and then the Saint-Domingue Revolution that gave birth to Haiti, also, and its aftermath, also contributed to the expansion of the sugar industry in Cuba, and then the coffee industry in Brazil. So this new increase, this new growth of slavery, I explained, propelled a new development in the institution of slavery that was entangled indeed with the rise of industrial capitalism, a phase that historians have then designated as being the second slavery. And here I want to share again my PowerPoint as we talk about second slavery, because the book, then this is a picture taken then in 1885, 20 years after the abolition of slavery in the United States, when the slavery still existed in Brazil, and in a coffee plantation. Of course, this is a picture that is staged, but and the book is well illustrated with photographs and engravings like this. So the book illuminates then the crucial role of enslaved women in the Americas. Even though in societies like Brazil, bondwomen were indeed numerically inferior to men. And here, by taking an approach then that relies on the importance of memory, I argue that the lived experiences of enslaved women are crucial to understand slavery, as well as what happened after slavery in the Americas. So several chapters of the book focus then on enslaved women in their various social and economic roles. And here I make an effort to affirm their humanity by showing then how they preserve their languages, their deities, their festivities, how enslaved people and enslaved women fought back against their honors, very often by maintaining a constant dialogue with the African continent. And also how Africans and their descendants played a central role in the construction of the Americas and the social and cultural fabric of the Americas. Of course, that writing this history of slavery that centers women raises some problems because most written documents were mediated by or produced by male historical actors, such as this very photograph that you see here. Then this is not a woman who took this photograph, is a man. Still, I try to highlight the stories of enslaved people and enslaved women, in particular, to show them as protagonists and not as simple supporting figures in this story. So, despite having been relegated to the background of historical narratives, enslaved women were central pillars of Atlantic slavery, as they gave birth to new enslaved people. And here you see this photograph showing then enslaved women, like many others across the Americas, who were working in the plantations while they were pregnant. And women, they were important even if they were outnumbered by men among enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. And this is a ratio of 2 men for 1 woman. Still, enslaved women, they gave birth then to children who were born in slavery, because slavery, the legal status was passed through the mother. So on the cotton plantations of Louisiana in the United States, or in the coffee plantations of São Paulo in southeast Brazil, women, they were performing hard work, hard physical work, in cities of Latin America and the Caribbean, such as Lima, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, and Havana. Bondswomen toiled all day in the streets selling food, often in order to be able to buy the freedom of their loved ones and their own freedom. But how to provide then this broad panorama highlighted by specific examples like this? So I draw, as I mentioned before, of course, on the existing historiography in several languages, then Portuguese, in English, Spanish, French. And I also, of course, draw on a large array of printed and manuscript primary documents, such as travel accounts, pamphlets, newspaper articles, slave ship logs, ship captains' journals, fugitive slave advertisements, slave narratives, wills, speeches, laws, and correspondences, then in these various languages. And I also incorporate visual sources, including then oil paintings, watercolors, engravings, and photographs as the ones that you see here. I also use artifacts, novels, motion pictures, monuments, and heritage sites, materials that are often not that are not used by historians very much. Finally, I want to emphasize as well that enslaved women, they worked doing a variety of tasks, for example, cooking, cleaning, sewing, seeding, and harvesting. Slave owners abused enslaved women, for whom refusing them their advances could result in severe punishment. Even then, enslaved women resisted by running away, by killing their owners, or by accumulating then small sums of money that allowed them over time to gather then what they needed to purchase their own freedom. And enslaved women, they nursed then the children of their owners. And many of these nurses, they then, even if we do not know their names, they appear in photographs that immortalize them. They took care of the children of other bondswomen, and of course, they took care of children of their owners. And to tell these stories, I also use visual sources like the ones that you have been seeing here. And this last one, and here I would like to read an excerpt from the book, then a section from the book, to give you a better idea of what I do when I am analyzing this kind or when I am in dialogue with this kind of image. Then let me just take the book here to read what I say about that image. Oh, I stopped sharing, but I cannot do that because otherwise you are not going to see it. Let's keep it there. And I read from the book. So, because wet nurses were in constant contact with slave owners, they were usually offered better working and living conditions than other enslaved women who performed domestic service. Their social status is confirmed by the existence of early photographic portraits of enslaved wet nurses and nannies holding the babies of their owners in their arms. One of these portraits that we see here features a young enslaved nanny. Sitting on a chair and seen from profile, she is holding a white baby. As the daguerreotype is blurred and scratched, both sitters seem to be a ghost of the past. As for many enslaved sitters, her name remains unknown to this day. But we do know she was associated with the family of a British merchant that was his name Alfred Phillips Will, who lived in Recife, Pernambuco, Brazil in the middle of the 19th century, and whose wife, Annie Stewart Twin, belonged to a Liverpool family deeply involved in the trade of enslaved Africans. What was the sitter's name? How old was she? Was Yule her honor? Was she ever manumitted? These answers are unknown, but because her image was captured in a daguerreotype, we can assume she was well regarded. Even though we do not know who she was immortalized in this intimate portrait that featured her large eyes calmly looking at the camera while taking care of the white baby. So several chapters of the book explore then how enslaved people daily resisted slavery by joining runaway slave communities, congregating and recreating their cultures and religions, and organizing also rebellions. In all these instances, I show how enslaved people's past and ongoing connections with the African continent mattered. Finally, the book also discusses bondsmen and bondswomen, the way they try to free themselves or to purchase their freedom up until the legal end of the slavery. And I explain also how thousands of freed people organized themselves to leave the Americas to settle on the African continent. And this started in the 19th century, then earlier before Marcus Garvey here in the United States. And I also emphasize the challenges that most of these freed people faced, those who remained in the Americas as well after emancipation. So the book seeks to show that whether in Brazil, in the United States, Cuba, Saint Domingue, or Jamaica, the institution of slavery and the individual and collective experiences of enslaved people had many elements in common. In addressing then the significance of the role of enslaved women in the Americas, I underscored the importance of urban slavery as well, in which bondswomen, as I said before, played important roles, especially as street vendors, marketeers, and domestic workers. So, of course, the book is part of a collective and individual continued effort to recenter Brazil and Africa in this large, tragic history of the Atlantic slave trade and the slavery, and also to give enslaved women their rightful place in this story. Then the book, to a great extent, is a testament then of more than 20 years of study that I have been studying the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade through archival research and also through field work in English, Portuguese, French, and Spanish on 3 continents. So, of course, just as any other work that seeks to be a synthesis, this book, of course, is not an encyclopedia and obviously remains incomplete. Not all regions and themes and periods receive the same attention. And I had to weave then together cases that allowed me to explore the central themes of the book, and also my choices were guided by the availability then in terms of what sources were available, then primary sources and secondary sources, and also were guided by my own experience and interests researching then and teaching the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and the history of African diaspora. So while providing then this comparative and transnational perspective of the history of these human atrocities, I follow then this approach that is the approach of African diaspora history, which treats the history of enslaved Africans and their descendants in the Americas as the continuation of their experiences on the African continent. So my point of departure to write this Atlantic history of slavery was the idea that despite national and regional contexts and the trends that oriented then the Atlantic slave trade from different regions in West Africa and West Central Africa to each part of the Americas, there were also many similarities between the institutions of slavery all over the Americas. And then as I was conducting research and writing the book, putting these stories together, these similarities, they became even clearer. In all the regions of the Americas where slavery existed to a greater or a lesser extent, enslaved Africans and their descendants, they left deep marks in urban and rural landscapes, shaping then foodways, religions, and cultures. And in these various areas, white settlers created mechanisms to prevent the emancipation of enslaved populations and to control freed populations even after the end of slavery. So although this long history associated with slavery and the importance of populations of African descent has been acknowledged in some parts of the Americas more than in others, full recognition of the harms caused by slavery and the Atlantic slave trade remains unachieved, and which is why the past of Atlantic slavery remains such an important topic of debate in the public sphere. And this is also why my work shaped then by this approach of memory studies that tries to understand how the past matters in the present. This gives me a unique point of view, I would say, when writing this Atlantic history of the slavery and the Atlantic history of these human atrocities. So ultimately, the echoes of this past have remained alive in the present. And because this past still matters, what this book does is to invite us to better understand the long era in which humans were racialized as Black, including those as at Stratford Hall, were placed in shackles to construct the hemisphere we know today as being the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that many folks are on Amazon right now buying Humans in Shackles. If they aren't, they should be. I have my copy.
Thank you.
Everyone should get their copy. It's a welcome decentering of something that we are probably all too familiar with, some of that distortion that she talked about in terms of the treatment of slavery. So we have some questions coming through, and let me start at the bottom. This is a question from Jennifer Halsey. She says that she's been to Ghana, Senegal, and Martinique, and that these places have sites of tourism, slave prisons, and castles. Are there any such sites of Brazil? And maybe you could just talk about memorialization of slavery in general in Brazil.
Thank you so much. Yes, then of course that this, whereas in West Africa, these castles have been there then over the past 50 years, then in Senegal is similar, even if Senegal is a more complicated story. The memorialization of slavery was slower in the Americas, including the United States and Brazil as well. So this, however, has changed. And for example, if you go to a state in Bahia that was the second largest, then Salvador in Bahia, that was the second largest slave trading port in the country, that is a place that African cultures and Afro-Brazilian cultures are very emphasized, but not much recognition about what role the slave trade played there. However, in the case of Rio de Janeiro, that was the first slave trading port, then it's probably the place where this work has been done in much more intensively, especially over the past 15 years, because there was a big wharf there when in Rio de Janeiro, when we had the preparation for the Olympic Games and then the World Cup, they recovered the wharf. Similarly to what happened in New York when they recovered the African burial ground, except that the wharf in Brazil, it was a wharf and a cemetery. So there is tourism, not as organized, of course, I would say, as in the United States or in other places of the Caribbean. But yes, you can visit places in Brazil in these former slave trading ports, and even in places that where we don't hear about. For example, the place where I come from in Brazil is the Rio Grande do Sul, the state in the south of Brazil, and there are places there where we can see this memorialization, including monuments, for example, to honoring enslaved people and the presence of populations of African descent.
And is there a grassroots push to do more in those terms, or?
Yes, there is. Then Brazil, for example, there is then for more than 20 years now, there is legislation making mandatory the teaching of Afro-Brazilian culture. There are, but the problem is always that depending on the government, things become slower and there are pushbacks. But there is this push. There is this push of to memorialize slavery, then, which I don't think that can be stopped. But especially, I would say that over the past 20 years, that this became more prominent.
Okay, great. Another question is, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas grew up speaking Gullah-Geechee, a language deriving from enslaved persons in South Carolina and the Georgia Sea Islands. It's a broad topic, but would you say a few words about interactions between African languages and New World languages among enslaved persons?
Thank you. This is an excellent question. And there is some discussion in the book about these interactions, and especially in a place like Brazil, then that these languages, African languages, then especially then from West Central Africa, what we would say that languages of the Bantu family, then these languages remained alive and were incorporated, and many words in Portuguese were incorporated in incorporated African words from these languages of West Central Africa. So this is much more recognized, and I would say much more incorporated in the language, in Portuguese language itself, than only a particular place as we have in the United States. So the book touches some of these issues also. Then, for example, names of food in particular. But of course, the book is an hemispheric view. Then we don't go deep in that. But there are many elements. There is a lot about this region in the book, and also comparisons, for example, that we see in terms of the culture, that we see African cultures in South Carolina and what you can see in other places in Brazil, for example, where women in particular were important then either as artisans or as then selling food and doing all kinds of activities in the urban areas.
I've got 3 more questions for you. Well, one of them's an easy one, but we'll take the harder 2 first. One's come through on email. The question is really about research that's been done on enslaved Muslims, particularly in the British North American colonies. Over the past, say, 20 years or so, there's been a renewed attention to the presence of Muslims among the enslaved populations. And that number is sometimes given somewhere between 3% and 30%, right? Is there any attention being given to that in Brazil? What are we seeing? Is there any kind of continuity of Muslim practice in Brazil from those early times?
Yes, thank you for this question. I would say that for the second part of the question, I would say that continuity not. However, there is a new migration of then populations, then especially from Nigeria, then from the Bight of Benin. This new migration then to places where Muslims were prominent during the era of Atlantic slavery, and then there is a continuity in that sense, but it's not then linear. This said, Brazil was very important in terms of this Muslim presence. Then, especially, there was in Rio de Janeiro, but there was in Bahia, there was in the south of Brazil as well. We do not have narratives as a genre as we have here in the US.
Yeah.
But for example, the biggest slave revolt, urban slave revolt, and the biggest slave revolt that took place in Brazil in 1835 that led to the deportation of those who allegedly participated in that rebellion that was led by enslaved Muslims and freed people who were Muslims. And then the name of the revolt was Malay Revolt. Malay was the name that was given to Muslims. And then this is in one of the chapters of the book. So, and there is another Muslim was enslaved in Brazil that he left a narrative, the only narrative that we have. It was written in English after he left Brazil. Then part of the narrative is about the time that he spent in Brazil. His name is Mohamed Gardo Bakwakwa. And this historian Paul Lovejoy wrote a biography of him that he published the narrative, and the biography is now coming out in April with University of North Carolina Press. So I mentioned Bakwakwa, but you should look at Paul Lovejoy's work to know more about him.
Terrific. Thank you for that. The last of the difficult questions, I suppose, is and maybe not so difficult, but you talked a lot about, as you've been doing this comparative work, especially, you've gotten more plugged into similarities as well as differences between, say, the lived experiences of the enslaved in Brazil and in the US. Could you perhaps speak to what you take to be the most important difference between the lived experiences of the enslaved in Brazil and in the British North American colonies?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I would say that perhaps the crucial difference is that is regarding the demographics that we were discussing in the beginning, because Brazil imported more than 10 times the number of enslaved Africans than the United States, and the Portuguese, they relied on replacing Africans who were dying all the time. So this is associated with the fact, of course, that people would die because of the hard working conditions, but also because manumission was much more present in Brazil in the urban areas. So this is something that, of course, manumission existed here in the United States as well, but in Brazil it was much more widespread in the urban areas. The other element I would say that is related also with this demographic element, which is the fact that in the United States, that what we would call natural reproduction, and the book addresses that, how it was not necessarily natural, but especially in the early 19th century, then slave owners in the United States, they rely on the wombs of enslaved women to renew the enslaved population. Then this birth rate in Brazil, it was much smaller because of the demographics and because of the fact that the working conditions were so hard that it was cheaper indeed for slave owners for the slave traders to introduce new Africans. So this would be one of the elements, these two dimensions, then natural reproduction and the issue of manumission, that in Brazil was different from here in the United States.
Do you have any sense of why manumission, in particular in urban areas, as you said, was more robust in Brazil than in the United States?
Because in the United States, like there has been then a lot of there were then legislation in different, not only for the urban areas, but in different states there was, depending on the period, legislation prohibiting manumission. We never had any legislation in Brazil prohibiting manumission. Then, but however, what happened in the urban areas, it was that it was self-purchased. Then especially enslaved women, they would be able to work in the streets because the population of slaves in the cities like Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, and so on, it could be 50% of the population of the cities. So these women, they would be allowed to work outside selling food, for example, and keeping part of their earnings. And with that, they would buy their freedom. Then it was not because the slave owners were generous, but indeed for them it was lucrative because they could get the money and purchase another enslaved person, and this is why then the manumission would be a cycle in the urban areas in particular.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you for that answer. Okay, so what do we have here? The last one. It seems to be. Okay, what do you think about the backlash in the U.S. against the teaching of African American history and slavery? Has this affected you and your colleagues yet? And do you anticipate it coming?
Thank you so much. Fortunately, it didn't. Then I teach an historically Black university, then where the teaching of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and the history of African diaspora broadly then is, I would say, then present at all levels. But yes, it's a difficult moment. Then I am lucky to be in a place where this is not happening. However, you know that funding, all these issues affect all of us, and we do not know how this is going to develop in the future. This said, I would say that there are so many other spaces where we can teach this story and where we should talking about this story as we are doing here. So this, I think, that is one of the ways of keeping pushing these stories to be told, to continue to be told. I think that whatever is the backlash today, it will never go backwards. It's impossible. Where we got at this point is part of the game that we have this backlash, but we cannot. Once this story is told, there is no way of untelling it.
Cats out of the bag. That's great. Well, thank you. And so more whimsical and on the topic of foodways, which you did raise in your talk, iconic Brazilian foods with African roots. What is your favorite?
What is my favorite? There is a sort of fritter that we can say that way that is called in Bahia. That is called acarajé. Mm-hmm. And we have the same in Benin, the Republic of Benin, that is called acará. Then this, I would say, that is my favorite. And the one in Bahia is better because there are a lot of condiments and sauces. So if you ever go to Bahia, but you also can eat this elsewhere, acarajé. Then take a look, and there is, I think you can even is a dog made of black eyed peas, then and it's fried, deep fried. It's very good.
Sounds delicious.
Yes.
On that note, Dr. Araujo, let me thank you for your presentation and for your scholarship and your research, which is tremendous and which is impacting all of us. And we are delighted to have been able to host you at Stratford Hall. And we look forward to your visiting sometime very soon, perhaps when the weather gets warmer. And thank you all for attending. Be in communication with you all soon. Don't forget our lectures next month and in April. Be on the lookout for those details. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you all.